wouldn't try that, my dear. This face was made for radio.
I vividly remember the release of the Hazbin Hotel pilot 4 years ago. It swept over every corner of YouTube and it was all anybody could talk about. Among the captivating characters, one was my favorite, Alastor with his enchanting transatlantic radio accent.
The Hazbin Hotel, a misguided path to redemption.
4 years ago, I wasn't confident enough to try sculpting one of the characters from Hazbin Hotel and do them justice, but now I'm a little better than I was back then, so let's give it a shot. Whenever I start a full character like Alastor, I really want to get in as much of the basic proportional forms as fast as possible. If you're familiar with traditional sculpting, you can think of this like creating the armature for your clay. You need that base to build everything on top of, so that's where I start here. In some ways, this is the hardest part of sculpting any character because it requires you to be able to break sometimes really complex forms down into their most basic parts. Luckily, I've done this quite a few times, so I'm well practiced. And I know it doesn't look like much right now, but give it a little and I promise it will shape up soon. Oh, and I'll get this part out of the way here. I'm working in the software ZBrush for this character, except for the render, which will be in Blender. More on that later. Okay, so once I finish the really simple early stuff, I typically move on to the face for a little extra TLC. I think this is really important personally, but not everybody does this right away. I like to start on the face early because it's the focal point of your character, and it also defines how everything else will go later in the process. If your character has a really misproportioned face, well, you can't really save that by adding more details to some cool clothing. It just doesn't work. From here, my process isn't always the same, and that's because I'll pick whatever interests me the most to work on next. Initially, that was the clothing for just a brief moment, but my attention quickly shifted to the microphone. It's such an iconic part of Alastor's design, and I knew it would be fun to create. For this microphone, I used some of my own dark arts, known to some as
polymodeling,
a technique that is forgotten by some digital sculptors. Sad, really, because it's an extremely useful tool that I use in every single project I work on. After the microphone, I wasn't sure what to work on next, so I sat down and made a list of every little thing I needed to work on for the character. Typically, I just jot these down in Notepad really quick. I'll have things in there as simple as arms, indicating that I need to work on the arms, or more detailed notes like move the left leg's hit to the upper third outside, inside, straight, which sounds crazy to people that aren't familiar with sculpting, and probably to some people that are familiar with sculpting. Either way, after I'm finished with my list, it makes it easy for me to move forward because I can just move down my checklist. Or in this case, up my checklist, because for some reason I decided to start at the feet and work my way up. Don't ask me why I did it that way, I do not know. So I moved on to the legs and spent way too long on them. I think I spent well over an hour working on just the legs. Don't ask why again, I have no idea. So after some coffee and telling myself I needed to focus up, I worked my way up the body to Alastor's coat. This was going to be interesting because I had the brilliant idea earlier to make the top section and lower sections two separate pieces, which I knew would create extra work for myself later, but I did it anyway. If you're thinking about asking why, you already know the answer. Working on this section of the sculpt was annoying, but I pushed through and came out on top with a low poly piece in the end anyway, something I told myself I would have to think about later. Next, I moved on to the details of the coat, which I smartly decided I would start low poly from the beginning, using my dark techniques that I mentioned earlier, the dark arts of
polymodeling.
It turned out that this was a very smart idea and would save me a lot of time finagling with the forms later as I continued to change the proportions. And I decided in that moment that I'd have to congratulate myself later for working smarter instead of harder. After working on the coat for what felt like half the amount of time I spent on the legs, I moved on to the hands. Now, Alastor has one less finger than a typical human, sporting 3 fingers and a thumb. Now, Follygon, you ask, does it make hands easier to sculpt when they have one less finger? No, not at all, actually. Doubly so when the hands have so much gesture and strong graphic shapes in their silhouette like here. So I went into these hands deciding that I would tackle them in 2 phases. This would be my first pass on them, and then I would return to them later to make a more refined effort to finish them. And this is a great time for us to introduce our newest segment.
Sculpting Advice with Follygon is filmed in front of a live studio audience. Hey, Follygon, so like, when things are really hard to sculpt, what should I do?
Get better at sculpting, noob. No, I only kid. Here's what I do. I go in with the idea that this is going to take multiple attempts. So I start with a rough pass, knowing that it won't be perfect right away. Then after a short break, maybe sculpting on something else for a little, I return to it with fresh eyes, ready to tackle it once again.
Wow, that's like really good advice.
This has been Sculpting Advice with Follygon. Yeah, so we're still workshopping the new segment. Anyway, it took me 2 passes on the hands to finish them completely. Next up is the face, which is my favorite part of working on any character. Luckily, Alastor was not super complicated, but it did still pose some challenges. My main reason for holding off so long on the face was that I wasn't sure if I wanted to simply paint it or actually sculpt it. After I spent so long working on everything except the face, it gave me plenty of time to think about how I wanted to tackle it in the end. And I decided that I was going to sculpt it. So instead of painting the eyes, I created primitive shapes that I could have on the surface to represent those forms. This is a really easy technique, and I often use it on characters of this simplicity. If you've never tried something like this in your own artwork, I would highly recommend giving it a shot. For the teeth, I went back and forth on a couple techniques, but in the end decided to create what's called a Boolean subtraction. All this is, in this case, is a tube of geometry that is going to carve out the separations of the teeth. I used this technique so that I could get the really nice taper that you see in the teeth separations for the final sculpt. I also used these tubes to create the outlines that you see for the eyes and teeth. Without these thick black outlines, the character feels completely off. Sometimes certain ideas don't really translate to 3D very well, and you have to come up with creative solutions, like this. What follows from here is what I call draw the rest of the owl. No, I'm only kidding. Most of the hard work is already done from here. Now I move on to polishing up everything that I've created up to this point to be more accurate and look better. I start with the hair, using more Boolean operations to combine pieces and blend them together, while using negative Booleans to subtract the sharp cutouts from the lower sections of the hair. And the antlers, which, what? I didn't forget about. I totally, oh come on, they're so tiny, you can like barely see them. I also took this time to work on the expression more and exaggerate what I had already created, breaking symmetry and making everything feel more. Push it to the breaking point and then nudge it back until it works again, is what I like to say. And then I finish up the sculpting portion of Alastor by exaggerating the pose, pushing everything, much like the expression, to read even stronger. Now it's time to prepare and send everything over to Blender for rendering. This process involves decimating my geometry to lower the poly count and make it easier for Blender to handle. Upon finishing this character, it was sitting at just around 10 million polygons. That's what all these individual shapes are here. So my character is made of about 10 million of these, and when I was finished decimating everything, it was about 10% of that, just over 1 million polygons. So I export that all to Blender, set up my materials and lighting. This is how he was looking in there with no post-processing effects. Normally I like to edit my renders in Photoshop to improve my levels and that sort of thing, but we don't need to get too deep into the technical weeds, so now it's time for the part that so many skip to. The final renders. Hey, what's going on, skippers? I know, you're just here because you wanted to see how it all turned out in the end. Well, hey, I think it turned out really well, and if you think so too, I think you'll also really enjoy getting to see how it was made. Consider going back through and giving it a watch if you did just so happen to skip here to the end. And to everyone that did stick around here through the whole video, thank you so much for watching. Y'all mean the world to me, and I appreciate you so much. You know, I've taught people that have worked at companies like Disney, and people on their very first day of learning to sculpt. So if you would like to learn everything I know about digital sculpting, check out my program, The Appeal Academy, at the link in the description, and my online store for other tutorials and my custom brushes. And one last bonus free recommendation for you: if you enjoyed this video, you will love this one where I created a sushi girl with another artist friend of mine in one of my most overly edited videos yet. Check it out, I know you'll love it. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.